Adams State College. Great stories begin here.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Adams State College faculty lecture. We're kicking off the 2011-2012 academic year with tonight's talk. We have Dr. Mark Finney coming to give a talk on propaganda, war propaganda in CNN's coverage. And Dr. Finney literally, did I say it right?
It's not really propaganda.
That's what was in your...
No, it isn't. It's not in my description.
He literally wrote the book.
Right. Which I didn't bring with
Which
me.
he doesn't have with him, but that is the title of the talk is also the title of the book.
It is in the library.
So, not that he's doing a sales pitch or anything, but he knows his subject, so listen up and ask some hard questions, and join me right now in welcoming Dr. Mark Finney.
Hello. So, it's actually not propaganda, and I don't think that's in my description.
It was in an email.
Oh, okay. Because what we're talking about, propaganda is overt, where the government tries to convey a particular message, and they did a lot of that. But CNN wasn't complicit in that message. And that's the big difference between what we're talking about tonight and sort of a propaganda model that we might talk about at some other point. So knowing is half the battle is the title of the book, and that's the title of the lecture for today. I wanted to start off sort of by talking, let's see if I can get this to work, about my own research, first of all, sort of as a preview to what I'm going to present this evening. I picked up this book today at the library. It's actually a prospector, to do some other research, and I wanted to read a sentence. It says, "The extent to which the media can influence conflict depends on factors such as the..." Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's not the right sentence. Here we go. "No discourse on conflict can be complete unless it involves the role of the media in the instigation, exacerbation, prevention, or mitigation of conflict." And that's really the approach that I take to the study of media. I come out of a conflict studies background, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But really, my interest in media has to do with understanding the role that media plays in international conflict. We can't talk about international conflict without talking about mass communication, without talking about media, because so much of our communication between parties in conflicts involves mass media, either overtly or, I don't want to say covertly, but unintentionally. And so it plays a dramatic role. And that's really the approach that I bring to the study of mass media. The research that I'm doing right now looks at the relationship between US media and representations of conflict and the conflict trajectories. And I'm focusing on US media, one, because it's a whole lot more accessible than a lot of other media outlets is to me. Two, it's in English, which I speak fairly well. But also because the United States has been involved recently in some very interesting conflicts. And the book that I'm presenting tonight is, a study on a very interesting conflict. My research is grounded in conflict studies. Some people call it peace studies. Some people call it mediation. But basically, it looks at a conflict as a process that takes place from a point where there are two or more parties that have a conflict over particular issues with one another through the resolution of that conflict. And by resolution, I mean, somehow the conflict is resolved. Sometimes, as in the case of the conflict between the United States and Iraq, that resolution was a war. Other times they negotiate their way out. Other times they negotiate by proxy and blah, blah, blah. So conflict studies, though, is sort of an interesting discipline in that it's a normative discipline. It comes from a perspective that favors particular outcomes. In conflict studies, we prefer to have conflicts, I should say, that are resolvable. Conflicts that are resolved nonviolently, and it's not just because we don't like violence, is because we find that equitable resolutions tend to come about more frequently when conflicts are nonviolent. And by equitable resolutions, what I mean is that the parties get what they want, or at least something of what they want out of the conflict. The other thing that happens with nonviolent conflict that tends to not happen with violent conflict is that conflicts that are resolved nonviolently tend to preserve relationships between parties, whereas violent conflicts tend to undermine long-term relationships. And we, in conflict studies, find that those are two fairly desirable outcomes, and so we favor nonviolent conflict. We look at conflict through this lens, and we focus basically on 3 elements. We want to be concerned with the interests. What are those things that parties are conflicting about with one another? Is it that I'm afraid you're going to attack me? Is it that you're holding somebody hostage? What are those issues or interests what are those interests that the conflict is about? Secondly, we're concerned with the parties for a conflict. Are there 2 parties? Are there 3 parties? Whatever. What kind of power imbalances exist between the parties? Who are they, of course? What kind of resources do they control? So we want to look at who's involved. We want to look at their role in the conflict. Are they primary parties? Are they secondary parties? Are they only just sort of standing on the periphery rooting for one side? These are the kinds of issues we're concerned about with parties. And then finally, we're looking at the strategies that exist, or tactics, either way, that exist for resolving the conflict. Of course, this is a conflict between the United States and Iraq that erupted into war. And so war, in this case, is one of these strategies. Other strategies that might have been employed are, mediation using an impartial party, doing weapons inspections, diplomacy, blah, blah, blah. We'll get more into that, into the specifics of this case. Sorry. Cool. What this means then is that we're looking at the process of the conflict through the media. We want to look at how the journalists, the editors, the producers, the videographers, the photographers, how they make decisions. We want to look at why they make those decisions. We want to look at the things that are constraining them as they're making their decisions, how they are tied financially, how they're tied morally, ethically, patriotically, to represent things in particular ways. And maybe I should just state something that's sort of taken for granted in the field, which is that media content isn't neutral. We tend to think in this culture that media content, no, I don't want to say that. We tend to hope that media content is neutral, that when we see something on the news, we can trust that what we're seeing is the reality on the ground, or is a reality. And it is certainly a reality, but it's always a particular reality. And sometimes that particular reality is benign, and other times it's not so benign. But we want to understand how they came up with the content that they came up with and why that happened that way. This is sort of a news sociology approach. By studying the process of newsmaking, we call that news sociology. We're studying we're doing a sociology on the journalists. We're examining the way that they conduct themselves and how that produces particular content. Another thing that we do in mass communication is looking at the content of media. There are a variety of ways to do that. In this study, I use both quantitative and qualitative methods. Quantitative methods means basically that I am going to, I'll get into that in a minute. I have a better slide for this, I promise. But we want to look at the content in a way that helps us explain patterns, but also helps us explain intensity, helps us understand what the content really looks like. What it is that when you click on your TV or open your newspaper, what it is that you're actually seeing, even though you may not be conscious of all of the subtle differences. And we'll look at some video today that helps explain how we come across with these, or how we come up with these sort of things. Finally, we also want to look at the impact of the media representations. And that's something that I don't really do in this study, but I do want to just mention that, studying media effects, looking at the way that people understand media, the way they incorporate it into their lives, the way that it affects their decision making is another significant component of media studies. So what we're looking at here is really how media works in a dialogical sense in terms of conflict. Conflict, in a lot of ways, can be thought of as a dialogue. It's, if I'm having a conflict with you, we're going to argue about it or talk about it at least, and that we're going to call a dialogue for the time being. Media is a part of that dialogue in any number of ways. Media is inherently dialogical in the sense that our cognitions, our beliefs, and our values influence our action. And media informs our cognitions, beliefs, and our values. Media representations are our principal source of information when we don't have any direct access to whatever is happening. I don't know if any of you all have been to Iraq in the last, decade or 2 decades, but I certainly haven't. The only thing that I know about what's going on over there is what I've seen in media, what I've read about, what I've talked about with colleagues and friends, etc., right? It provides us with information that we incorporate into our lives in a way that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. And that very significantly informs the way that we understand the conflict. In addition to that, we have this whole idea of public diplomacy or telediplomacy. And this is a theory that as TV, principally TV, has grown in prominence, diplomats have decreased in prominence. Our representatives talk to one another, around the world via TV, via media accounts. George W. Bush and Saddam Hussein, who were not having very much communication directly during this conflict, were communicating to each other via the representation of each other in media accounts. Famously, during the Persian Gulf War in 1991, Saddam Hussein watched the war happen on CNN. That was his best information source at the time. Oh shit, they're invading right now. I know that because I'm watching it on CNN, right? I'm not kidding you. This is actually how he got his best information. And it's not so unusual. A lot of our leaders employ CNN and other, mass-mediated news sources to provide them with information. There is a television in every one of our senator and congressman's office, and it's either turned to CNN or to Fox, right? And it's on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're all looking at the New York Times probably every day. They're all looking at their local papers probably every day. So even, so we are all influenced by what we, perceive in mass media. But our decision makers are also influenced by what they're seeing in mass media. And the conflict is even more, because our leaders talk to one another via mass media, that also affects the conflict. So dialogue, as seen in this view, isn't necessarily the direct go-between between us right now. Dialogue takes on a longer term kind of a perspective. It's not necessarily a reciprocal or short term, but encompasses the interplay of rhetoric and action in a longer term. It means we're going to talk to one another, but when you do something, I'm going to see it, and that's going to influence the way that we communicate with each other as well. So media serve as the megaphones for our parties when they're in conflict, or for parties when they're in conflict. It's the way that they talk to one another. And everything that comes across that screen influences, or has the potential, I should say, to influence the conflict in some way. Furthermore, just because I almost have to say it, media accounts, in this country at least, should be tied to the kind of policies that we come up with. This is, at least in theory, a democratic population, right? And we as citizens, as voters, as constituents, play a role, at least in theory, in the way that our decision makers operate. When they make a decision, they're supposed to be doing it with us in mind. And so the more that we consume this media, the more that it influences our perspective, the more we ought to be affecting the way that policy is created, in addition to the fact that they're all watching it too on CNN or Fox or whatever. So the book is part of a longer-term project. My goal is to look at the content of multimedia organizations, multiple media organizations, their coverage of the conflict between the United States and Iraq before it became a war in 2003. And before it became a war is an important part of this research project. In this iteration of the research, I took CNN as my object of analysis. The reason I selected CNN is because it's an extremely popular news source. And not only is it an extremely popular news source, but it's known principally for its coverage of conflicts, of crises. The ratings for CNN are fairly flat most of the time, but when there's a crisis, they spike. And that's what I thought, that's one of the reasons why I decided to choose CNN. Secondly, it's not explicitly ideological. and of course I'm talking about Fox News right now, right? I will be looking at Fox News later in this research project. I mean, like years later, hopefully, in this research project, because I'm trying to develop a much more holistic sense of what the media landscape looked like at the time. But for the moment, I wanted to figure out, what is the mainstream media saying about this conflict? What kinds of things can we learn from it? And just very, very briefly, we can look at the history of CNN. It started in the late 1970s. It actually went on air in 1991. Ted Turner, who's a bit of a, one of these firebrand capitalists, started it because he felt like it was an important thing to do, to have an all-news channel. It was the first 24-hour all-news channel. It took advantage of a fledgling cable industry. Cable was only just existing in the early 1980s. And so, Turner was able to benefit from that. He purchased all those TVs in senators and congressmen's offices and tuned them to CNN and said, as long as you keep CNN on, you can keep my TV and my satellite dish. Now, of course, there are other things on and probably other people funding it. But CNN has an enormous network, and it's not just news content now. They're now TBS and the Cartoon Channel. But really pay attention, though, to their multi-news networks. We've got CNN International, CNN IBN, CNN Airport, CNN Turk, CNN Espanol, HLN, that's Headline News, CNN Chile. I mean, these are all networks of CNN content, which means that what we see on CNN is different than what the rest of the world is seeing on CNN. But it also means that the kinds of things that we see on CNN has the potential to reach a much broader audience. According to Wikipedia, as of August 2010, CNN is available in over 100 million US households. And this is probably true. It's close to what I had from 2008. They claim an audience in 890,000 American hotel rooms. Globally, CNN International can be seen by viewers in 212 countries and territories. It's all over the freaking world, which is part of the reason why I selected it as the object here. So let's get into the actual research. What I'm interested in is looking at the coverage of the conflict before it turned into a war. I want to look at who the principal parties were as they were represented in the content. I want to look at what the interests were that were supposedly between the two countries. I want to look at the avenues through which the conflict was able to be resolved, at least as it was represented in the content. And what we're looking at is parties, interests, and strategies, right? Just in slightly different words. What I'm really interested in, though, is whether the content was biased towards particular perspectives, and if so, whose perspectives and in what way were they biased? How did the coverage treat the conflict situation, the themes, and the parties? Were the parties and interests and strategies treated equally? As in, did Iraq get as much time as the US did in terms of its coverage? Did they talk the same amount about war as they talked about diplomacy? Were all of the interests and potential strategies sufficiently or evenly explored? Were particular interests given more or less weight? Were their authenticities verified? We know in hindsight that some of these interests that were promoted as between the United States and Iraq didn't actually exist. So how did they deal with those things during the coverage? Were particular policies emphasized? Did journalism serve as impartial relayers of information, which is the ideal of what we expect from them? Or did they serve as cheerleaders for a particular cause? Or were they mouthpieces for some perspective? These are the questions that I'm principally interested in. And I should mention, right off the bat, that hindsight is awesome. It allows us, or it allowed me in this case, to realize, oh wait, hold on, I went too far. Where's my hindsight? Dang it. Well, you guys are missing a slide. Oh no, wait. I went too many pages. Right. Sorry about that. The methodology for this research is a multi-methodological approach. I'm doing a quantitative analysis and I'm doing a qualitative analysis. Quantitative, in this case, means that I'm going to look at the presence or absence of themes, ideas in the coverage. I'm going to mark them numerically. I'm going to look at the favorability of particular themes in the coverage, and I'm going to mark those numerically as well. I created a 1 to 3 scale. When we're talking about a particular interest, 1 means that they are treating it unfavorably, 3 means that they're treating it favorably. I count all those things up, and that's how we get a quantitative analysis. I randomly selected 400 stories that were transcribed on LexisNexis, and I analyzed every freaking one of them. Iraq was the keyword in my search. I was looking for times mentioned in favorability. I was trying to distinguish between support from sources and support from the story. And by story, I mean more journalism. So, of course, if you get George W. Bush up there, he's going to have particular favorabilities. But we have this expectation of journalists that they're going to be much more neutral in their representation. That's what I was interested in. Let's see. I was also interested in studying who the sources were, how frequently they were represented, the favorability that they were represented with as well. And also whether statements made by President Bush were questioned at all, and whether the United States was provoked, neutral, or unprovoked. Here's the hindsight quote. Hindsight, awesome, right? We know that there are or were no weapons of mass destruction. We know now that there are or were no chemical weapons, and that Iraq was as far away from creating a nuclear weapon as I am. And I am not close to making a nuclear weapon. We also knew, because of this, that noncompliance was not an issue. Noncompliance is this idea that was promoted during this period that Iraq needed to be dealt with because they were not complying with the UN mandates that they disarm themselves, right? Well, if there are no weapons, then they have complied, rather, and noncompliance is not an issue. We also know Iraq did not have the potential to attack the United States with any sorts of missiles. Iraq has never had that kind of capacity. I mean, the US only has, I don't want to quantify it, but only has a limited number of missiles that can actually travel from the United States all the way to Iraq. This is why we had to stage the war in Kuwait, because we can attack from Kuwait fairly easily, right? But attacking from the United States is really freaking hard, and it was impossible for Iraq at the time. We also know, in hindsight, that there was no relationship or no overt relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. He never had communication with any of the high al-Qaeda leaders. They never traded weapons. They never traded secrets. They never did any of that stuff. But these were all ideas that were prominent in the coverage of the pre-war period. And we can look at the frequency that these things showed up in the coverage. And we can see that I've ranked these in terms of how frequently they showed up, right? And maybe the easiest thing to do is to look at the percentage of stories. Weapons of mass destruction was present in 57% of the stories in the sample that I took of CNN during this period. Noncompliance was present in 39% of the coverage. The connection with al-Qaeda was there in 37% of the coverage. Now, mind you, this doesn't say anything about the favorability of these issues. And just telling you that these issues or interests were present in the coverage at these frequencies. If we take it apart and we look at just the times that they were mentioned, regardless of how many stories they showed up in, we see that the weapons of mass destruction were there in 33% of the coverage, or were mentioned a total of 1,107 times in 400 stories. Maybe that's an even better way, which is almost like 3 times a story, right? So these were presented in the coverage fairly frequently. Oh, I should maybe describe. Okay, so weapons of mass destruction is pretty clear. Non-compliance is clear. Al-Qaeda is clear. Evil dictator, right? This is the idea that Saddam Hussein is an evil dictator and he gasses his population and that he's an evil dictator. They call them a lot of things. Iraqi threat, I already discussed. The other idea that I wanted to put in there is the idea of the economy. Because during the time, there were certain American intellectuals who were saying things like, oh, we're really just going to Iraq because we want their oil, right? And so I quantified that as well. And that was present, as you can see, less frequently than any other interest in this conflict. Did I turn to page too quickly? We can also, oh yeah, favorability. So we've looked at how frequently these things showed up. Now we can look at how favorably they were represented in the coverage. You can see that all of the interests were represented at an above average favorability. 2 in my scale is an average favorability, which means that most of the time that these things were discussed, they were discussed in a way that made them appear to be real interests that the United States has with Iraq. You know, we're saying basically is at a rate of 2.3 out of 3, they said that weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq. I've also broken it out here between source support and story support because, as I mentioned earlier, we sort of expect our journalists to handle things a little more neutrally than we expect the sources to. But in this case, you can see really that the story support and the source support are fairly even. There are only a couple of places where the story support is less favorable, and none of them are below favorable or even average, or even neutral, excuse me. All of them are presented in a favorable way. What I also found is that there is a layered representation of interests. Certain interests were represented frequently together. And it's almost as though they were piling these things on to increase the impact of them. So weapons of mass destruction, that sort of makes sense, was mentioned with non-compliance fairly frequently, right? If there are weapons, then they're not complying. Makes sense to mention these things together. Weapons of mass destruction with evil dictator. That makes a little bit of sense because, you know, he gassed the Kurds, right? And so weapons of mass destruction is inclusive of chemical weapons, so it makes sense that that's in there. Evil dictator and Iraqi threat. These things were presented together fairly frequently, which means that they said Saddam Hussein is an evil dictator and he's a threat to the United States. These things don't go together naturally, these two concepts. And so that's sort of the idea that I'm presenting here when I'm saying that there was sort of a layering of concepts that increased the impact. Right. We can also look at the policy options that were available to us at the time. You can see that by far, war was mentioned more frequently than any other policy option. In fact, war was mentioned more frequently than all of the rest of them combined. Support for all of these strategies hovered around 2. And interestingly, support for war was slightly less than neutral. So their representation of war was not quite positive. Certainly not as positive as, for instance, with conflict resolution, which was actually only mentioned in 2% of the stories. So there's a bit of a disconnect there that we'll talk about in a little bit. We can also see, oh man, I'm moving slow, aren't I? That the sources and the interests and the policies were represented together fairly frequently. You know, if we're going to talk about weapons of mass destruction, it makes sense that we're going to talk about inspections as a way to deal with it. If we're going to talk about evil dictator, we're going to talk about a variety of sources to deal with him. Favorability for Iraqi threat was the only statistical relationship that I want to mention here is that when they talked about Iraqi threat, there was a relationship between also talking about war. So what that basically means is that, you know, you can bet if they talked about Iraqi threat, they were also going to talk about war. Sources were represented like it shows right here. Sorry, I don't want to spend too much time on it because I'm already running late. I just want to point out that President Bush and the White House were present in the coverage much more frequently than other sources were, which sort of makes sense because a lot of this information was coming out of the White House. I excluded this idea of guest commentators. Guest commentators were all over the coverage. They were present in 41% of the coverage. And they significantly did not want weapons inspections as a policy. The guest commentators were strongly against weapons inspections as a policy. The lowest favorability for sources was for Iraqi officials, which means that when Iraqi officials were on, they were all sort of like, oh, he's just an Iraqi official. That's not really what they said. But 1.8 was the lowest level of favorability for a source. The highest favorability for a source was for U.S. military officials and soldiers, and for foreign war supporters. There were countries that were supporting the war, and I noted which countries those were, and when their representatives were there, they were treated very favorably in the coverage. President Bush's comments and ideas were questioned at about 22% of the stories, and U.S. activity was presented as either provoked or neutral in 96% of the stories, which means that except for 4%, they really didn't say anything about how the United States was instigating this conflict. Which is not, of course, to say that they were. I'm just saying that's not a part of the coverage. I'm going to move through that. So what we see in this, though, is a strong favoring of the Bush administration's perspective. There was a significantly greater quantity of coverage devoted to the president and the White House. There was a significantly high favorability for the interests and policies favored by President Bush, except for war, which was presented slightly negatively, including those interests that were subsequently disproven. I also found that there was a consistent undermining of alternative perspectives in the coverage. Saddam Hussein was represented as an evil dictator at a dramatically high favorability in 36% of the coverage, and I'll talk about the significance of that in a minute. But the idea that Saddam Hussein is an evil dictator undermines a lot of other arguments that can be made about how to resolve the conflict. So what we should do wasn't totally clear if you just look at it as straight numbers. There was a high favorability for conflict resolution, but it was only present in 2% of the coverage. There was a slightly low favorability for war, but it was present in 80% of the coverage. So there's a real disconnect here, and it brings into focus the idea of agenda setting. This is the idea that media doesn't tell us what to think, it tells us what to think about, in a nutshell. So if they are presenting war as the option in 80% of the coverage, that helps us think about what to think about. If they're presenting conflict resolution in only 2%, that also helps us think about what to think about. It means we're not really thinking about conflict resolution. We are very much thinking about war. Which brings us to the qualitative data. I mean, what does all this stuff mean? How on earth did I determine favorability? How on earth did I, figure out what they were saying about these sources? Well, the qualitative methodology will give you guys an example of how we did that. But the reason why is because we use qualitative data to supplement, the quantitative data in most cases. It gives us a lot of texture to the coverage. It helps us figure out what these things really mean instead of just sort of quantifying them. So I selected 6 stories from those 400 that I thought really represented ideas or concepts that I wanted to explore further, and I got video of these. And the reason why I got video is because transcriptions don't give me any sense for tone, right? It doesn't give us any sense of the visual qualities that are being expressed with the text. It also doesn't help us understand anything about the music that accompanies the text. So, for instance, this is going to work. This came on every time Wolf Blitzer talked about the conflict. One of the things that I would really like to do, that's the one. One of the things that I would really like to do, but I haven't really been able to do it yet, is to try to develop an understanding for the, I don't want to say psychological, but the impact that these kinds of tonal qualities provide to us when we are consuming media content, right? That music, it makes me feel tense, it makes me feel excited, it makes me feel almost threatened. The high tones, the da-da-da, it just makes me feel that way. I don't have any data to support it, but I would really like to find data. If any of you have any resources that, and I've talked to you, I think, about this, about how we can use tones or how we can analyze tonal qualities in music, I would really like to see that stuff. But getting the video enables us to do this kind of analysis. Where's my thing? Am I onto my movie yet? Yeah. Okay, so the first video I'm going to show you is Vice President Cheney gave a speech to a conservative think tank or a conservative, what did I call it here? Oh, Political Action Committee in January 2003, and CNN covered it almost in its entirety. We're not going to watch the whole thing. Let's see which. Nope, that's the wrong one. Switch this to video. Oh no, switch this to video. There we go. And we press play.
We will also continue our efforts to address the grave danger posed by the outlaw regime in Iraq. We will not permit a brutal dictator with ties to terror and a record of reckless aggression to dominate the Middle East and to threaten the United States of America. "12 years ago, Saddam Hussein agreed to disarm Iraq of all of its weapons of mass destruction. For 12 years, he has violated that agreement, pursuing chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, even while UN inspectors were in Iraq. Last fall, thanks to the leadership of President Bush, the UN Security Council unanimously passed a resolution giving Iraq one final chance to disarm. Inspectors were sent to Iraq not to determine whether Saddam has weapons of mass destruction, but simply to confirm that Iraq truly was disarming itself as required by UN Security Council resolutions. Unfortunately, the declaration that Iraq provided to the United Nations last month about its weapons and missiles program clearly demonstrated that Saddam has absolutely no intention of complying with the world's demands. Some time ago, the UN confirmed that Iraq has sufficient material to produce over 25,000 liters of anthrax, more than 38,000 liters of botulinum toxin, and as much as 500 tons of sarin, mustard gas, and VX nerve agents.
Okay, he goes on like this for another 10 minutes or so. I'm going to fast forward a bit, though. Because, oh, what is it?
The Vice President Dick Cheney speaking directly, bluntly, a no-nonsense kind of speech, chilling in many respects, saying the Iraqi government's leader, Saddam Hussein, has absolutely no intention of complying with UN demands, showing in his words only defiance, delay, and deception, also making the case that Iraq right now, he says, is protecting terrorists, in his words, including Al-Qaeda.
Okay, so there are a couple of really interesting things that happen in this video, and of course you missed a bunch of it. But really what we're looking at here is a very, I don't want to call him opinionated, but a guy with a real perspective who's allowed 10, 15 minutes of airtime on CNN to make the case. And he does it very forcefully. There's no doubt in his mind that Saddam Hussein has done all of this bad stuff. And he tells us that there's just no doubt at all. But then Wolf Blitzer, the journalist, comes on after him and repeats it all, adds a certain credibility to it because journalists are supposed to be impartial. So when Blitzer comes up here and says, Vice President Cheney very seriously laying out the case, these are all super important issues and we should be paying attention, that's the kind of shit we pay attention to. And because he's a journalist, because he's got this reputation, we expect more out of him, but also we take it in a little more believably than if it was just Cheney up there making the speech. That Hussein is evil was used to undermine questions about the rationale for war. He said, Saddam Hussein is an evil dictator, which just means, in addition to the fact that he's an evil dictator, it means we can't trust the guy. It means there's no point in doing any sort of negotiation because he's bound to renege on them. He gasses his own people. He colludes with Al-Qaeda. How could we possibly trust him to honor any agreements? These are the implicit arguments that are being made in Cheney's speech. Cheney, and guys didn't see this because I fast-forwarded through it, but Cheney's speech also lifts the United States. He talks about how we are just trying to defend the free world, and we were attacked on September 11th, and this is our responsibility, and blah, blah, blah. So on one hand, he's bringing up our case, and at the same time undermining that of Saddam Hussein's at the same time. His evilness was assumed in the coverage, and that fact was used to rebut any number of counter-arguments. How can we trust him to honor commitments? So he must still have weapons of mass destruction. He must still be pursuing them because he's such an evil dude. Furthermore, how can you be so naive as to think that Saddam Hussein wouldn't do all of these things? So it also undermines counter-arguments by undermining those people who make those counter-arguments as naive, as ill-informed, as unable to think realistically, rationally. He repeatedly asserts a connection between Hussein and September 11th, almost as though he's like the 20th hijacker. And doing so recalls our deep emotions around September 11th, right? It makes us think about what a deep tragedy that was, how hurt we were by that thing. By making that connection, it makes him appear to be a right candidate for retribution for September 11th, even though we know that he didn't actually have anything to do with it. Furthermore, he talks a lot about Iraqi threat, which is a great excuse for a preemptive war. Preemptive war was a term that was created during this conflict to describe what the United States was planning to do. We're going to attack them before they can attack us. Well, if there's no Iraqi threat, then a preemptive war is ridiculous. But if we keep saying that they have the potential to attack us, that attack has the potential to be catastrophic, then it justifies a preemptive attack. I got time, right? Okay. I'll cut it. I've got one other video that I want to show you, and this was on this program, Crossfire. And the title of the program was, let's see, Is Islam a Religion of Violence?
So what's the truth? Is Islam a peaceful or a violent religion? Are Christians like Robertson and Graham preaching love or hate? Bob Novak.
Dr. Falwell, just a few days after the terrorist attacks, President Bush went to the mosque in Washington, and this is what he said. Let's listen to him.
The face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace. They represent evil and war.
Just the other day, Dr. Falwell, the President of the United States directly disagreed with Pat Robertson. He said Islam is a religion of peace. Now, sir, I'd like you to tell us which side you're on. No kidding around. Do you agree with George W. Bush or Pat Robertson?
Well, I don't kid around, Bob. You know that. I'm a strong supporter of President Bush, and he is doing exactly the right thing in singling out his enemy and not putting America at war with over 1 billion persons. I also agree with Pat Robertson. I'm not a student of the Quran, I must be honest. I also agree with Pat Robertson that there's evidence worldwide that some bad things are coming out of the world of Islam right now. And I would just give 2 examples. One, in the 30 or more Islamic nations in which Islam is in the majority and control the government, there is zero religious liberty there, zero. You let a Catholic priest, a Jewish rabbi, an evangelical minister go there, proselytize, preach the gospel, share Jesus. Unlike America, Europe, Asia, he will pay terrible. Secondly, I have not seen in the headlines of America's major newspapers a single, not one single significant American Muslim organization condemn what happened to Daniel Pearl at the hand of some of these Islamic crazies. So if you really want to get off that reputation, give us freedom in your countries and start condemning these nuts. If an American Christian did that to a Muslim, you know we'd stand up and condemn it.
Jerry Falwell, you're just drifting us away from my questions. I'm afraid you would. But I just want to give you another quote. We'll put it up on the screen from Dr. Franklin Graham. Last November 19, he said, of Islam. It's a different God, and I believe it's a very evil and wicked religion. Now, we're not talking right now about whether somebody made a statement here or made a statement there. I just can't believe you, Jerry Falwell, are agreeing with your friend Pat Robertson that it's a violent religion, and with your friend Franklin Graham that it's an evil religion. Do you or don't you?
First of all, Franklin, a little later, modified what he was saying there. But I just believe that we have to look at the facts. I don't believe that all Muslims are violent people. Like you, I have many Islamic friends who are just the opposite. But I'm saying that the evidence on the international scene, that is Islamic countries where they control the government, zero religious freedom, and very few, if any, Islamic organizations in America are condemning these damnable things they're doing around the world.
Ibrahim Cooper, this is one of those rare nights where Bob Novak and I agree that Pat Robertson's remarks were obnoxious. But I do have to ask you this question. If you look at the history of Christianity, and I'm a Christian, there's a lot of ugly stuff that went on in the name of Jesus. I mean, you talk about the Crusades, you talk about the Inquisition, you talk about the Holy Wars, killing for Jesus, people went into battle citing passages of the Bible. Christianity has put that violence behind it. Why is it that Islam has not? That even today, there's still people who take the most primitive passages out of the Quran and use them as their motivation.
Well, it's true, obviously.
I'm just going to go ahead and stop it there. It's not really important what he says. And there are a couple of reasons for that, actually. He, of course, denies the whole thing. But what we're looking at here is a debate, right? This is a debate program. The idea is that we get two people up there and we have them debate with one another. And, that provides us with objectivity. It provides us with neutrality, right? By providing a guy on this side and a guy on that side who can argue with each other, we find that we have journalistic objectivity. But in this case, we've got nothing close to journalistic objectivity. And the first reason why is, how many of you guys have heard of Jerry Falwell? Before, like right now. How many of y'all have heard of Ibrahim Cooper? Or Hooper, excuse me, I didn't even say his name right. Nobody. So we've got Jerry Falwell, president of Liberty University, leader of the moral majority, very influential, very famous televangelist, versus some guy that nobody's ever heard of, right? There creates a reputational imbalance in and of itself before they even start debating the issue of whether or not Islam is a religion of violence. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the perspective of the show begins from the idea that Islam is a religion of violence, and we see that in both of the first two segments there. And you guys only saw the first 30 seconds of the second segment. But Jerry Falwell gets up there and says, "Well, I don't think Muslims are evil, but their governments sure are evil, and the fact that the American Islamic groups haven't said anything about it suggests that they're evil too," which begins from a perspective that Islam is in fact evil. Then we get the interviewer talking to Ibrahim Hooper, and he says to him basically, "Why is it that Islam is so immature compared to Christianity, which is so awesome?" Right? So there's an imbalance there as well. What we see here is a structural imbalance because we don't have evenness between our presenters. And then we also have the situation, and if I had time to show you more of it, you'd see that Hooper spends the whole time going, "We did condemn it. We're not all evil. There are Islamic governments that allow Christianity. You could go to Iraq or wherever if you wanted and preach the gospel and not be killed." Jerry Falwell, even at one point, tells Ibrahim Hooper that he better watch his back when he goes home that night because of the things that he says about Louis Farrakhan. I mean, the perspective that they have is a very pro-Christian, pro-Western perspective of either ignorance, willful ignorance, I almost have to believe, about Islam and the way that it exists in the world. The reason why I'm showing you these two videos, though, is because what we've got here, and I'm going to forward to my conclusion because I'm out of time, and I'm sorry about that, Robert, is that war is a logical and a foreseeable conclusion when we have a conflict that's represented this way in our principal sources of information. And granted, CNN may not be the principal source of information, but that's why I'm doing follow-up studies with the New York Times right now. I'll do Fox News later. I'll do NPR later. So I'm trying to get a broader perspective on our media landscape at the time. But basically what we've got here is one party that's presented as violent, as evil, almost inherently so, connected to our current and most brutal enemies, who has the capacity and the will to attack us with catastrophic weapons. The interests that were represented to us were dire. They were presented in a way that they appear as though they're imminent. And the policy options were presented in a very uneven way. Even though war was presented at slightly less than neutral, favorability, it so far outpaced the other policy options that considering them as options, especially when you think of it from an agenda setting perspective, it almost threw them out the window. We're not going to talk about conflict resolution because it's just not present in our mind. I already talked about preemptive attack. We've got this outlaw regime, which brings to mind sort of a law and order approach to the way to deal with it. We have to bring Saddam Hussein to justice is an important theme in this coverage. Weapons of mass destruction suggests this catastrophe that could happen at any time. And Islam, as we saw in Crossfire, is used as a term to separate us from them. Even when we weren't talking about Islam in a really negative way like they did in this program, it still separated us in terms of the way that we saw ourselves and the way that we saw the other in the world. Right? Got it? Cool. Good. So when you look at it then from a conflict studies perspective, when you look at resolving interests, there really aren't that many interests to resolve if you look at the coverage as representative of the conflict. Most of the interests that they discussed didn't actually exist. Certainly the ones that were represented most prominently didn't actually exist. And so there weren't really interests to be resolved, which meant that weapons inspections, of course, wouldn't work because there weren't any weapons. It meant that UN intervention probably wouldn't work as well because there wasn't an actual threat. There wasn't a relationship between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. The data suggests that war was actually maybe a goal of one side in this conflict, war in and of itself, rather than a tactic which is used to pursue conflict as it's typically thought of. Because the interests weren't present nearly as much as they ought to have been, because war was so prominently displayed, it suggests that war was actually a goal that was being pursued by one of these parties. And CNN's representation of this conflict really cheerleaded that approach, presented them much more frequently, presented that idea much more frequently. They didn't do a good job of parsing the information, of fact-checking. And there are a lot of reasons why, which I'm not going to get into. But that's the end. I've given you 30 seconds for questions.
So actually, we have plenty of time for questions, and if no one minds, I was going to start with Mike. Given the video that you showed, that last one, I got the strong impression that the way that it worked, Bush went to a mosque and said, Islam isn't evil, it's peaceful, and these other people are not. He looked like he set himself up to be the good guy, and just let CNN take people, United States people, the other way. Do you think that was planned?
I found that when I was doing the quantitative analysis, it was really useful to separate President Bush from people who worked for him in terms of how I was quantifying them, because of precisely that point. President Bush isn't going to go out and say, Islam is an evil religion, but Vice President Cheney might go out there and say something like that, right? Don Rumsfeld might go out and say something like that, Condoleezza Rice. So by separating them, I can quantify that and also look at really what George Bush was saying as well. Let's do it.
I was wondering that this was a fabricated, concocted war is pretty clear. I mean, there was a congressional working group that had been in existence since the first Gulf War for regime change in Iraq, even when Clinton was president. So there were clearly, high-ranking folks already on board that already concluded that war would
I think it
probably
was a
be the only.
congressional group, but there was a working group.
Well, a working group,
Right.
yeah, and so I wonder if well, it'd probably be difficult to find any ties to CNN, like editors or anything like that, but.
One of the things that I did find, and that I didn't present up here, is that a lot of the guest commentators were former military, former intelligence, former government officials. People that were tied in with this kind of working group, yeah, this kind of idea that they were promoting.
So, well,
I don't want to say that they were promoting, I shouldn't have said that.
So one of the things I was thinking was you mentioned that, because I sort of was curious to know more of this, how this new media, 24-hour news, et cetera, had modified the behavior of people involved. Like you said, Saddam Hussein got his best information in the first Gulf War from, and so, and I remember, I think you did some work on the embedded journalists, which obviously, they're not going to show an embedded journalist, they're not going to show U.S. soldiers getting slaughtered. I mean, they're not going to show that. So it's clear that the media's form itself has modified behavior of leaders, troops in the field, all kinds of.
Well, one of the things that's not in this analysis is media effects, right? I'm not talking about how we perceive this conflict as we saw it on CNN, because that's really difficult and like totally separate, area of the field. But looking at that question, how are our leaders actually affected by this 24-hour news cycle is even more difficult because they don't want to talk to us about it, The only way that we find out about media effects is by testing people and by looking at the way that they're affected, right? George W. Bush is not going to sit down with me and talk to me about how he was affected by, the 24-hour news cycle or anything else. Marty?
Mark, I'm just curious about your perceptions of how the media has really changed in events like this. For example, if you were to go back and apply the same sort of analytical reasoning to coverage of the Vietnam War, coverage of the Korean War, the Cuban-American Missile Crisis, have things really changed?
Yes and no. One thing that has changed, especially in terms of our analytical sense, is that we're much more conscious that media are a party in conflict. CNN, as I mentioned at the beginning, their ratings spike when there's a giant conflict that they're covering, right? Which means that they have a stake in what's happening in the world in any given moment. So they do play a role in the world, not just as impartial relayers of information. The other thing that really affects the way that media interact in sort of conflict zones are the rules that are set up for media in the conflict zones. Sue made reference to a paper I did called Good in Bed, where I looked at embedded journalists and how their levels of favorability were different than the favorability of non-embedded journalists, right? Embedded journalists were the only ones that had real access to the war zone, and it creates a circumstance where they almost, the research shows that they presented the news more favorably, and I can't say that it's because they were allowed into the war zone or because they were being protected by the U.S. soldiers, but certainly those are reasonable conclusions to draw. So the circumstances that, that they're allowed to have in a war zone affect the way that it's covered. Did I answer your question?
Well, how different was it for the journalists who reported on Vietnam?
Right. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
that'd be, I think, an interesting study as well.
Yeah, I think so too. Eventually I'll get there. Yes.
Well, Marty, your question, I was thinking, probably this is the, now the age of 24-hour news sources, right? And they've gotten a lot better, as you showed, Mark. You played the music,
right?
The running caption underneath and all that. And I mean, it is true, the Vietnam War, the first war that came into everybody's living room and stuff, but we're seeing shots that were a handheld camera somewhere, and the news hour was generally an hour, right, in the evening. You know,
Right.
it wasn't 24 hours. So I think that, again, the very form of this new media, you know, what is it McLuhan says, you know, I mean, television is a cool medium. It does all the thinking for you.
Right.
You know,
Well-
it's, you know, whereas reading about it, you have to kind of think a little more.
And you do bring up a good point, which is that the 24-hour news cycle has accelerated the time span of all sorts of decision making, right? You know, when something happens in Iraq, we expect Obama or whoever to say something about it instantly, which really has the potential, at least, to change the way that reflective decision making can take place. And you know, the other thing is that technology has improved so dramatically that we can see things in real time that took, you know, days to bring back in the Vietnam War.
I wonder, you know, their effects on us as viewers, because we're saturated with this stuff and it's all whizzy with great music. But what about the demands on the journalists? You know, they've got to come up with this crap to put on so many stations, on the internet, on Twitter, 24 hours a day, where back in the old days, you know, when I was a kid, like Stu said, it was an hour of news a day, or a little bit in the morning, evening, and 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock news, and that was it.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
so you don't have
you
to
know,
produce as much. You have a lot of journalists.
the good news
coming
for
up with
English
2
communication majors is that there are a lot more of them now.
Right, but when I was watching that coverage, one of the first things that struck me, maybe as a psychologist or just as a person, was they look lazy. All they're doing is reporting what this person says, what the White House says,
Right.
as opposed to any fact-checking or any other view.
Yeah.
White House said this, White House said that.
Right. Well, and actually, that was a real problem for CNN in its first decade. Filling 24 hours a day was a huge problem for them. They had no idea how they were going to do that, and they, you know, the first several years they, you know, spent a lot of time running onto set with copy, you know, at the very last second. So yeah, certainly. Yes, ma'am.
How do you think the media actually then impacted the decisions by the leaders? I mean, it seems to me that it actually may have sabotaged what we were identifying as our interests.
That's a really good point. I mean, so in terms of impact, you know, we can certainly say that, assume for a second that all the other analysis that I'm going to do with the New York Times and stuff have similar results, right? Similar findings. Then we can certainly say that it was pointing us towards war as how to deal with this situation. It was pointing us towards looking at these particular issues as significant and meaningful and as dire, right? So, and you're right, to the extent that those particular interests and the pursuit of that conflict strategy undermines our interests, then yeah, absolutely.
Well, it could be used to get, you know, our adversaries have access to that same information, as you said.
Right. You know, one might argue, you know, that part of the reason why the coverage, assuming that President Bush liked the coverage, one might argue that part of the reason why they continued to do it in the way that they did is because they were hoping Hussein would just back down, would just relinquish control and save us all a big fight, right? A fight. So yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is that, you know, there's no way to tell, because, you know, even though, you know, Cheney and what's his name, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice have all written memoirs, you know, none of them have really talked about what they were really thinking about at this time, other than what they've already told us, which is, you know, we don't want war, we just want to save the world from this evil dictator with weapons of mass destruction. So there's no way for us to know really what they were thinking at the time. It's entirely possible that that's actually what they were thinking about, and I, you know, don't want to diminish that idea. The coverage, you know, if we are to use the coverage as representing what they really wanted, it doesn't bear that out. That's, you know, the only conclusion we can draw about the thought process on the part of the administration from this. There's other research out there. Yes, sir.
I would like to see the media change to encompass more fair reporting, things like that, something that you'd like to see.
For that, you should take my journalism 255. I think that there are a couple of things. You know, there's a whole area of both practical education and theory called peace journalism. And some of the things that peace journalism talks about is that, you know, news has become as much an entertainment commodity as movies. And part of that is that they really overemphasize conflict, dramatic visual imagery, polarization. And those are things that tend to exacerbate conflict or make conflict more intense and lead it towards more violent courses. So I would say that those three things, polarization, violent imagery, and what was the third one? And what? And individualization, yeah. But these are all things that tend to exacerbate conflict and make them worse. If they were to, if they were to report peace processes in the same way that they report, violent conflict resolution processes, and we can call this a conflict resolution process, right? This war was a conflict resolution process, a process in which two parties, multiple parties, I should say, negotiated using a variety of means to reach some sort of resolution, right? So if they emphasize, diplomacy or other less violent means of resolving conflicts as much as they do the violent content, then things could be at least potentially better. I mean, but at the same time, explosions get eyeballs, right? They want ratings. That's what their job is. And in addition to delivering us with information, their job is to deliver eyeballs to advertisers. And as long as explosions and vitriol and strong rhetoric provide that, that's the kind of stuff they're probably going to cover. Yes, ma'am.
I take a stab at my dream for like new media, and I'm thinking like the way that these individuals choose our media sources is a way of depowering CNN. I don't watch CNN. I pretty much get my news through Twitter now, which is a text-based medium. It's not the explosions and lights and that sort of thing for me. And I choose which media outlets I want to get my headlines from. I get BBC, I get NPR, I get several different headlines that I invite into my mind space. And I think that we have so many choices now in the way we access media, that television and sitting, turning on a television to give me what I want versus using a handheld device or an iPad or something like that to go get what I want. I think that's going to be part of the change.
You raise the more sources that we consult, the more opportunities that we have to get a variety of ideas on any issue, news related. I have already collected the data for my New York Times iteration of this project, and I've done a little bit of preliminary data analysis, and to be totally frank, it looks very similar to the data that I got from CNN. And the New York Times is, that's the paper of record, and it is a text-based. This is if there is a single most important news source in the United States, it's the New York Times. And my preliminary findings at least show remarkable similarities between their coverage and CNN's coverage. My fear is that when I do NPR, it's going to be just the same. Yeah.
So we know these media companies are businesses first and foremost. So they're trying to drive up sales from advertisers and capture more and more people, as you say, eyes.
Sure.
When they're competing with each other, they can't just one turn and say, we're going to be more unbiased because they're going to lose competition. Because people in our human nature will go to the flashy lights, the imminent conflict, something that makes life interesting for whatever reason. How is this as a whole going to get any better at all? I don't see how the peace journalism is going to change the big picture.
Again, you should enroll in Journalism 255, taught every fall. I guess there are, one is that we can get more citizen journalism. One of the things that the internet provides us with is a lot more sources. And Twitter, we can go to a lot more sources to get our news. And so, and we also find that when there's a larger variety of sources, we also find that there's more variety in the content. Because just like Fox News caters to a politically conservative audience, the Huffington Post is going to cater to more of a liberal audience. And so by paying attention to news sources that we find embody, as a conflict resolution, a conflict analyst, by paying attention to sources that I find embody those kinds of ideas, I can do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change the media landscape. And the other thing is that even though there are lots of other sources, there's still sort of a pyramid scheme going on wherein, all these alternative sources are still relying mostly on mainstream media to provide them with the data that they use to make those newscasts.
And all that mainstream media is still relying on just a few journalists that are out in the field, or a few other references they have in political parties or whatnot.
Right. Oh, and that was actually something I wanted to mention, is that we also do see a real over-reliance on very authoritative sources. The president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, et cetera, right? And these are the people who we can count on to put out the party line. The lower you go on the hierarchy, the less likely you are to be quoted on CNN, right? Unless you're Ibrahim Cooper and they just want to put a patsy up against Jerry Falwell. Did you have a question? And then
do you feel that your findings would have been any different based off of the way the words were used? Because
what do you mean?
You said that separation and the way we decided that Islam was them and America was us. It's Islam and the evil dictator. Americans are kind of set up to think a dictator is evil. We believe in democracy here. So if I was a writer to say just a dictator or someone from the Middle East or use different words, do you think your findings would have been different throughout?
You're absolutely right. And there's this great book called Collateral Language, which is all about the new vocabulary that was created to talk about the war on terror and the war in Iraq. And it talks about things like, embedded journalists, preemptive war, evil dictator, weapons of mass destruction, and how our understanding of the definitions of some of these terms have changed and were used extremely effectively as persuasive tools. So yeah, absolutely.
I feel like the ethical use of America has changed dramatically due to the language that we decided to use and to identify them versus us and the separate issues that we were going to, address initially.
Right. And the fact is, this is a world wherein all of our, most of the time when somebody speaks publicly, it is a highly scripted occurrence. And they are being extremely careful to use the terms that they mean, and the terms that they mean are often those that they think are going to derive the most impact. Yes, sir.
Last question, Paul.
Just a footnote, really, but in defense of the New York Times, it might be pointed out that it rather almost spectacularly repudiated its own editorial coverage and news coverage of the run-up to the Iraq War.
Right. Yes. The New York Times did apologize. But what good does that do us, right?
Right. Let's thank our speaker one more time for a great talk.
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.